Welcome to the State of Cyberwar, a production of the CyAN Secure in Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hello, and welcome to the latest in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's series of State of Cyberwar podcasts and videos. I'm here today with our friend and member, Hugo Tarrida. He's in Madrid. Hugo is a master's graduate from King's College London in intelligence and international security, currently working as a cybersecurity consultant. Also, one of our excellent CyAN first batch of mentorship program candidates and graduates. So great for you to join us.
Thank you.
So, the State of Cyberwar was an outgrowth of our long-running podcast series and video series on YouTube about topics relevant to cybersecurity around the world. And in this group of recordings, we decided to talk a little bit more about everything around information warfare, national cyber defense, policy, and whatever kind of governs the broader adversarial relationships in the realm of cybersecurity, cyber attacks, what groups, what state actors, what motivations, what policies that we are dealing with in this arena. It's obviously very fascinating, especially for those of us who are in the civilian space. And I want to stress that these are conversations between people who we know a reasonable amount about the topic. Hugo is, as an academic in this field, is more an expert than I am. But I think in general, we know just enough to be dangerous. And what we're aiming for here is a conversation with, about topics that are relevant to cyber war. And with that in mind, let's get started. And what we discussed when we were preparing this was starting off with a series of recordings around different countries and their approaches to this topic. And what I thought of what might make sense would be to group what we I'm going to say Western countries in quotes see as these traditional adversary countries. So China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and group those to some degree, and then later on talk about the quote unquote West, the liberal democracies, the market democracies, your US, your UK, your NATO members, your Japan, your Australia. Not because these are necessarily aligned or allied, but because they share certain aspects in common. There's some similarities that we just can't get around. And one thing, Hugo, that you mentioned before when I started talking about China was this idea of a very Western bias, Western approach. And we agreed that today we're going to talk about China. James Briscoe, also a fellow CyAN member, and I did a video a little while ago about Chinese information operations, particularly disinformation. And this felt like a natural continuation of that. And we'll get into that bias in a moment, but I just want to be absolutely clear that, I've lived in Asia, but never to a degree where I could say I'm an expert in for example, Chinese culture. I absolutely have a bias. I think we both of us do. So I think this is going to be part of our conversation to expand these topics a bit.
So I agree with you. Like, we do have a bias, but obviously we do know somewhat about the topic and how they act. But more importantly, what we see and what we perceive internationally, like at the global scale. So how they try to act more aggressive, more offensive, or defensive in some cases in order to achieve the different objectives, which, to be fair, this does happen on a global scale. So not only those countries, like, for example, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, but it is true that as a Western perspective of enemies and possible danger to our lifestyle and way of living, communication, more in sense of culturally, we do see them more aggressive, but also because they do tend to act more aggressively in some cases. So, for example, North Korea is a known aggressive cyber actor to attack nearly everyone that they want or can in order to achieve their own objectives, their own goals, specifically in order to deter enemies, mainly the US and South Korea, but also to prove a strong point how they're able to defend themselves, but also attack at the same time. which does happen more related to countries in that area which are related per se, rather than in the Western sphere, which tend to be more passive, or at least more not so openly aggressive, and tend to do things more in the secretive and underway.
I think that's something that you will often hear, for example, from Russian or Chinese or Iranian, especially government sources, where yeah, but for example, the U.S. has attacked, Iranian information infrastructure or Russian information infrastructure. And I think it's very, very difficult and but also very important to kind of walk a fine line between, on the one hand, understanding that all of these countries, they have their own interests, they have their own fears, they have their own objectives, some of which are legitimate, some of which aren't. And the same applies to quote unquote Western countries, but at the same time to call out when there are offensive operations, aggressive operations, things that go against perceived rules or norms, and without falling in the trap of saying, well, both sides, right? So I think that's one thing that we're going to be very conscious of when we talk about these various countries. All of these have different cultural aspects, techniques, but I think what really got me thinking about grouping these in such a way was that all of these have been aligned in some way or another with each other. Again, we're talking about China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Not necessarily all of them, not necessarily in the same way. These alignments, these cooperations, they go all the way from very, very informal, having the same objectives with the same perceived adversaries, all the way to formal agreements, formal defense pacts, commercial treaties, etc. Same geopolitical interests. A couple of examples that came to mind were North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells for their war in Ukraine. There was an announcement of a Russo-Iranian defense pact last December. China has traditionally had a very light touch with North Korea when they've launched missiles all over the place. They've both engaged in aggressive saber rattling against not only the U.S. but also Japan and other actors in the Pacific, the Western Pacific. Russia and China are both members of the BRICS, and it kind of goes on from there.
Yeah, can I also add here? In some cases, for example, China, Russia, and even North Korea, they do also share a border, like a physical land border, which also implements and move towards that kind of alliance you're talking, whether it's like actual formal or just like relationship kind. Having an actual border makes them move and target, well, rather than target, try to be within the same sphere, because obviously you don't want to be enemy with someone who's right next to you with the possibility of a land invasion, rather than having to take the long way per se. So all of these different factors, which you're also commenting,
and it's really interesting when you include topics like the decline of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russia's kind of Central Asian attempt to build on the ghost of the Soviet Union with its alliances with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., which has kind of gone away, right? So that exactly those geographic borders start making things very, very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Not only that, but also then you just look at the military capability itself, the economic capability, for example. Obviously, China, second world economy, like second biggest. Russia, very big, but more in sense of military. China, very strong military as well. North Korea, more or less. No one really knows how well they do, but they do tend to align.
Lots of artillery shells, apparently.
Yeah, missiles going over Japan as well. So these kind of factors also affect them, tend to pull them together. Mm-hmm. And then if you add the one real factor, which is the West, seeing the West as an enemy or as a possible adversary in the near future, will band them together even further and even tighter. Mm-hmm. Which then obviously is like something which is expected and more or less common to see around the world also, not only in that particular area. And then adding with Iran, for example, very close ties with, for example, Russia now, but also because once again, we're looking towards the common enemy. So this is the typical phrase of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, that also applies. The fact that Russia was enemy of the US for a long time. Then Iran was also enemy of the US. Then it was like more or less common that they would drift together. And now even more comparing that they're both more or less well, Russia is at war, and Iran seems to be getting closer in a
Well,
more conflicting way.
I'm not going to jinx it. We
Yeah.
Um, I think one thing that we need to also clarify when we talk about cyber war, it's obviously a very, very huge topic. The distinction that instinctively came to mind for me was, or this not the distinction, but it seems to me that we can easily break it down to two high level topics, and those are peacetime and wartime.
Yeah. And I'm going to interrupt you here and say straight away, I do agree, but it is a very Western mindset. So the fact that, for example, Russia, China, and probably many other countries don't see that difference in barrier regarding cyber. So obviously there is peacetime and wartime when there's an actual like land traditional war itself. But in cyber, for example, many countries just tend to constantly attack, constantly defend, even though they're technically in peace and they're not at a war with someone else.
That's a really good
So
point. No war has been declared formally since 1945.
exactly. And there's still huge amounts of, for example, cyber attacks, cyber incidents, espionage, and so on between countries
Mhm.
that some of them are more or less known adversaries, but others are not, and still happens. And just to emphasize, that is a Western perspective, and something that I do believe that the Western world has to adapt to the ever evolving like cybersphere, because you can't only attack someone when you're at war, only defend when you're at war, when other countries are doing it all the time and getting an advantage. So you can't like fall behind in that sense, but
Mhm.
at the same time you can't become too aggressive to break that barrier of like ambiguity to actually start a war.
Well, this is a really good point. And I guess I should put peacetime and wartime in quotes. Because for me, your quote unquote peacetime operations are things like propaganda, disinformation, cybercrime and sabotage, and espionage. The things that do not necessarily involve shooting, but obviously it gets fuzzy when we talk about things like proxy wars in the Middle East, right? Iran is sponsoring a whole bunch of different groups via the Quds Force or the IRGC. you know, Western countries, whether they're, directly involved in places like Mali with the French, or not anymore, I guess, or Syria, Iraq, Jordan, in the case of the U.S., who just lost a few service members there, dropping missiles on Houthi rebels in Yemen. Um, it gets a little fuzzy, as you said, even with the quote unquote Western mindset, it gets confusing. But once the shooting actually starts between actual adversaries, which we haven't seen between, for example, the West, quote unquote, and China since 1953, right? Um, between the U.S. and Russia, unless you believe that Russian advisors were involved in Vietnam, or against Wagner Group in Syria in the last decade, but there haven't been any kinetic events, I guess, especially not at a large scale between these groups of countries. I guess that's for me, with my Midwestern mindset, that's for me the distinction. Because once we have this quote unquote shooting war, which hopefully we're not going to get to, fingers crossed, then we also have direct military operations in support of the guys with the guns, or defending against the other guys with guns, and directed and open attacks on critical national infrastructure, sabotage, the digital equivalent of blowing things up. And there, I think what you're getting at, I think that gets really tricky, because if you look at, for example, I'm struggling for the name here. I think it was in 2000, and for my notes here, Titan Rain 2003 was a Chinese APT group attacking GitHub. And the US State Department described that as an attack on US critical national infrastructure. That, I think, goes more into your issue of war versus peace not being sufficient anymore to describe this kind of, it's not even a dichotomy anymore.
Yeah, but not only that. So I'm going to go a step further and say not only cyber sabotage, but also, for example, mass cyber spying. That,
That's a
although
good
as you
point.
say, can be regarded as something that can happen during peacetime, but that's something that, for example, during war, intelligence collection is always crucial. So then why wouldn't you regard it as also something during like cyber war, or even further, just constant, which is what's happening? countries are constantly spying on each other in cyber, trying to get information, knowledge, steal, for example, intellectual property, technological advances, or even going even further, just spying a whole government. For example, that happened in Spain a few years ago, where this suspected country, which was Morocco, but it's not confirmed, was able to infiltrate spyware within a whole government organization, like all personal telephones, for example, and some critical information was all stolen. That can be regarded as something more of aggressive rather than just something peacetime.
Oh,
Something
absolutely.
that's
100%.
around that vague boundary between where do you actually become physically involved per se, or just keep on with that cyber defense and counterattack.
I'm gonna be controversial here, and say I think the reason why espionage, even if it is an aggressive act, I don't think it's designed to be hostile per se or aggressive per se, and it's because there is kind of an unwritten, unspoken rule that it's just what one does. It's always happened. I mean, if you look, I mean, Chinese, you really good point about the industrial espionage, because if you some of the various Chinese groups, um, we've seen tremendous campaigns against not only U.S. Defense industry participants, but also tech organizations by various Chinese actors, and pretty definitively attributed to Chinese actors. Not only your People's Liberation Army affiliated APT groups, but groups that were initially, I think, helping the Chinese to some degree play catch up with Western technology. They've been advancing extremely quickly, but obviously wanting to obtain Western military secrets, production secrets. The famous example being the W-88, the nuclear warhead, where a Chinese, originally a Chinese national nuclear scientist, was proven to have exfiltrated warhead designs of the most advanced American nuclear warhead to the Chinese. Right? There's always rumors about is the new Chinese stealth bomber, does that include technology from the the Valkyrie, I think, is the new one, or whatever it's called, or Shadow or Spirit or something, I forget the name, or the F-22 and the F-35 next generation American fighters. And it's pretty clear. I mean, the Americans and the British and to some, the other countries are doing the same thing, whether it's trying to steal economic secrets, whether it's spying on, for example, government functionaries, whether it's just trying to figure out what the other country's military industrial complex is up to. I think that's always been a part of, quote unquote, peacetime operations.
Yeah, but I'm also gonna go further and say I completely agree. But the fact that all countries do it means that obviously they're not going to call out someone for something they are also doing it. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. And I do believe that when they actually do call out, like, hey, we caught you spying, hey, you stole our data or you stole our plans for whatever, it's because they want to publicly show that they were able to catch them, that they were actually doing it, and they were able to stop that like initiative from the offensive part.
That's
so, for example, China,
point. Yeah.
like China is very well known for stealing huge amounts of intellectual property and like designs and obviously military aspects as well. And they're called out a lot, but I imagine that they're called out so little compared to what they actually are able to like achieve. And for example, at the same time, Russia, another country which is very active in the cybersphere, they are now obviously focused on Ukraine, but for a long time they were able and focused on more, for example, disinformation campaigns, not only like stealing information, but spreading misinformation, something that, for example, China also does. But Russia was actually, like my opinion, the one that's managed to do it the best.
Absolutely,
for a long time.
The masters of it. Absolutely, Internet Research Center. Another not only Wagner Group affiliated, but also GRU affiliated actors. 100% agree with that. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So, for example, they are able to keep on going, spread, for example, not only disinformation, but lies, false images of, for example, Russia or the West itself. So paint for the US as worse than they are, or someone like another country better for their own benefit. And in the end, that's what they're trying to achieve, like every single country, work towards their own objectives, their own benefit, their own growth. But obviously each country has different ways, different methods, and each one I do believe has their preferred way of action. So, for example, I do believe China tends to go more with like spying and exfiltration of information, while Russia is more of let's change your view by disinformation campaigns until we're our friend, right? Or
Well,
until we're more or less
it's not only
easier.
though. It's not only. I mean, your point is a good one. We'll do a whole conversation on Russia in the next few weeks sometime. And by the way, I do want to call out the excellent work that, for example, the Not So Thoughts team have done. So I'll link to that, notsothoughts.substack.com, have analyzed a lot of these actors and motivations. But I mean, China, for example, as you know, James Briscoe and I discussed this in our previous conversation, has done a huge amount of disinformation work, right? And it's really interesting because I mean, are you familiar with the Great Canon?
Nope.
This is a tool that has been used for enormous DDoS attacks. It's a DDoS network. I don't know if it's still in existence, but that was what was behind the 2003 GitHub breach, which again the U.S. State Department called out explicitly as a hostile act. And there's a lot of analysis that says, well, actually, the Chinese didn't expect to get into that much trouble for it, even if it was pretty clearly a demonstration of their capabilities, because they have used it against, for example, opposition media sites abroad and domestically to just take things down, right? One organization I used to work for was actually very, very worried about, not being too vocal in their criticisms about China, because they figured, well, we just simply do not have the technical capabilities to stand up against the kind of DDoS takedowns they could launch against if they wanted to. I think that fear was overblown, but there is obviously a component to that. And I think that there's a stereotype that, your Chinese operators are going to be mainly espionage focused. But while I agree with your point that we don't see a huge majority of what happens in the background, whether espionage or malware or whatever, I think a large part of that is also we don't see the kind of successes that intelligence agencies in quote unquote Western targeted countries have taken these down. Because just like the Chinese are not going to, they're only going to trumpet what they want people to see. Your NSA, your CIA, your French intelligence, your MI5, they're not necessarily going to let on your GCHQ what successes they had unless they want to make it clear that we're capable of countering these threats and activities.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like in the end, most of the time, they tend to be either part of the like secret organizations within the country or very affiliated to them. So obviously, they're not going to reveal everything they do. They're not going to be public and vocal about it unless very necessary, or they believe it's going to have some other point, like achieve an ulterior objective. Because I do believe, for example, when the CIA releases a statement, that statement is very focused for someone to read. For example, maybe in China, like, oh, we're going to release saying we found Chinese spyware and Chinese trying to hack the CIA itself, because we know someone in China is actually reading it, learning about it,
Exactly.
and we want to know that we are capable to like actually stop them if we found. That the ulterior motive always has to be kept in mind, because it's something that all like intelligence agencies do, and even now more like cyber, which is very linked, also do.
Exactly.
And it's also because like also going back to the point where we don't know like half of what they say. We also don't know the success as the extent, and for also very important how long they've been doing it. So some like spyware and malware exfiltration might happen for like 5-10 years until someone actually notices through like a back loop or something. So it's something that's very scary per se, because you can also be a target as an individual. Obviously, it's more unlikely regarding like government to government interaction, but it's something that every country can do. And for example, China is very active in it. And even more, another point would be that China has so much population, so many people working for the government, that they also
I saw a number once. I saw a number once. I think the MSS alone has something like 600,000 employees.
Yeah, like that's exactly my point. They have so many people, they're able to do so much more than, for example, smaller countries. And just by sheer numbers itself, whether the technology might be somewhat like slower or be behind the US, their numbers actually like account for that discrepancy.
Well, let me chuck one your way. One thing I wanted to mention before we got into specifics, so I kind of forgot here, is I think it helps to understand what the motivations are. And the ones that I wrote down for China are secure trade routes and resources, so economic, as a part of national security, increased international influence through both positive and information and disinformation or negative propaganda, intellectual property theft and defense espionage. Prepare to degrade its main adversary capabilities in support of both trade conflict as well as possible military conflict in places like the South China Sea or Taiwan, right? Yeah, and I for me, again, with my bias, these are kind of what drive Chinese strategies and Chinese support for various groups and activities, right? For me, my understanding is that at some point, you mentioned before a really good point, that at the top of everything, you have to see the Chinese Communist Party, right? That the motivation is driven by a combination of desiring a stronger stature for China, a stability for China, better influence, better economy. Does that ring reasonable in terms of what actually drives their activities?
I mean, I do think it's reasonable, and even more, I think it's something that every single country strives for, like better economy, better internal stability, and external stability as well. Having, for example, as well, better interest, relationships, better alliances as well. They're all something that countries want to achieve, something that countries do in different ways. But I will say China, for example, has tended for a long time to be not seen doing this. So they wanted to stay out of the radar while actually achieving all this, for example, influence, all the information in order to expand their economy, all the intellectual property to increase their technology. They've tried to stay under the radar as much as possible, while other countries, for example, the US, more like Western way of thinking might be, have been very vocal. So the US has always been like, hey, we are now allies and publicly allies, and now we have a strong partnership with X country, and we're doing like military operations together and training and so on, while China has always been more like the quiet part, the quiet side of it.
Really though, because I mean, my impression is really that, I mean, if you, it seems to me that there is a lot of noise coming out of China about basically this China strong idea. You know, whether it's an insecurity born of, you know, was it the 100 Years of Humiliation, perceived or actual abuses by colonial powers, whether it's, you know, playing catch up technologically with the West. I mean, whenever, for example, Western firms or governments call out these PLA associated or sponsored or affiliated APT groups, the denials don't sound that strong from the Chinese side.
I mean, I agree, but I also think that China's not like being like as vocal as China is not something bad or something to see as an aggressive point. I mean, you have to take into account the historical aspect. Like China was invaded for
Exactly.
many years. China has been always the downside of the like economic partnerships for decades, and now that they're able to actually be on the like top side, being the strong man, they're not gonna like waste their advantage and waste that opportunity, which is something that, from my point of view, is somewhat logic. Like every country given the opportunity will do the same. But I will say, China, I think it's also becoming more vocal, more active, and like aggressive, maybe even
Mhm.
as somewhat a reaction to external powers, but also in terms of like internal influence, like in the region, they also want to ensure that they stay on top. So regionally, I do
I mean,
agree.
this was the hope. If sorry for interrupting, but this was the hope when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, right? And since then, you know, we've had an almost complete reversal from the attitudes of you know, Jiang Zemin and other general secretaries around the time, where we've seen a much stronger nationalistic approach, an almost hardline approach under Xi Jinping, which seems to me, you know, to also be coupled with what is often perceived as a very aggressive economic approach. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative and you know, trying, whether it's trying to or just happening to tie smaller, less potent countries into predatory loans through
I mean,
infrastructure projects.
yeah, I agree, and I completely agree. Like, for example, with the Belt and Road Initiative, China is investing a lot of their own money in expanding, for example, the trade routes. But obviously, they're investing that money in other countries in order to gain something back.
Hmm.
Like, there's nothing for free itself.
Hmm.
And China has been very vocal. But I also believe that China is now able to do this because they were very quiet for a long time. They were the ones that were slowly growing in the background. They were gaining up the strength, like massing together in order to now be able to have little opposition regarding like smaller countries or even the region itself. So now countries have to either join with China in order to get like those economic advantages or just not grow because they don't want to be with China.
Well,
And both views,
ironically enough, that China now is increasingly exposed to, for example, loan defaults by especially developing countries.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's all has its benefits and it's also its downsides. But obviously, this attitude is something that's changing, and as you said, it's very present. The change itself since Xi Jinping has was in power, and now that he's been able to be established, breaking the two-term constitutional agreement, that might even change further. Like I wouldn't we wouldn't be surprised if China suddenly becomes even more aggressive, more expansionist itself,
Hmm.
not only regarding economic aspects, but also like military, technologically, expanding their, for example, cyber capabilities and becoming more aggressive, more offensive, and even more vocal about it. Now that Xi Jinping is, well, expected to be in power for a very long time, under one single leader, they're able to do that because the leader itself is safe in the position. So they know that the term is not going to end.
Well, I mean, it's also China. I mean, what I'm reserving judgment because I even though the PLA has made enormous strides, both in terms of its kinetic forces and its cyber capabilities. Um, I mean, China is also economically not doing that great right now, and they've got a whole bunch of issues. They've got, a fair amount of dissent. They've got a population problem. I'm gonna let's revisit that one in about 5 years. I'm gonna be really interested. One thing we got 5 minutes left here. One thing I want to touch on is one thing I picked up in a Liberation Army daily article from 1995, were the concepts of information defense, information offense, and also this idea of the three warfares, which is a PLA, People's Liberation Army strategy, including that in one, media and public opinion warfare, two, psychological warfare, and three, legal warfare. So using legal tactics to tie up your opponents or perceived opponents abroad using their own legal systems. And I found this super interesting because these all, obviously fit into my, again, admittedly biased category of peacetime, advantage building. I mean, we've seen, I guess, psychological warfare. You could throw the disinformation campaigns into that, as well as the public opinion warfare. What I found really interesting was this idea of legal warfare as part of information operations.
I mean, I agree. It's something that I have did not think about before, but it does make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And even more because what you're saying, if they use their own enemy law system itself, a legal system, they will not break it because they themselves will not be following their own internal laws. Because one thing is to not abide by, for example, international rules, which might not be binding itself.
Well, I
So
mean,
you do
they've
look
shown, I
bad.
mean, China has shown that it is willing to do that when it perceives it to be in its own interest, which is, for example, I forget which court it was, the ruling about how many dotted lines? Nine, is it 9 or 7? I forget how many dotted lines they have in the South China Sea, which basically said
Yeah, yeah.
it's complete nonsense. And the Chinese just said, well, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I completely agree. And that, I think, goes back to the point of international organizations, like international treaties and so on. And even more, just the international legal system does not have anything to back it up rather than, okay, let's just sanction a country. So it's very weak in ways to stop a country from actually acting against it. For example, what you're saying of China reclaiming the whole of South China Sea, although it's claimed illegal, they're still going to do it. They're still doing it and still expanding their own influence and even territory by land creation in South China Sea. the international court and community has continued to say that's illegal to stop, and they're still doing it.
If Dubai is anything to go by, then building islands out of sand is not necessarily very sustainable. But this raises one last point I want to touch on, and that goes in the direction of what you were saying earlier about this fluidity between quote unquote peace and war. And I wonder to what degree we can see Chinese, for example, destructive APT operations or espionage, or even malware operations against critical infrastructure during quote unquote peacetime as a preventative measure against, for example, economic sanctions. Like, let's say the US, the world's biggest economy, decides to sanction China, the world's second biggest economy, I think it is right now.
Yeah.
To what degree are the Chinese basically trying to say, we can really mess you up if you do this? Aside from the massive economic impact when you can't buy container ships with the stuff from China anymore, but we could really wreck your infrastructure, wreck your economy.
I mean, I completely agree. It is a very strong point in way of influencing someone in a very passive aggressive way. Like, obviously the US has the capability, for example, to sanction China, but obviously if China attacks back in a cyber way, so dismantling, for example, electronic networks, so just like electricity itself in a state or in an area, that's gonna have
the power networks are a classic example of critical infrastructure that's perceived.
Yeah, and going over on top of that, that's gonna have an impact not only in the US itself, but on US public opinion, how people perceive their way on the country's behaving against, for example, China. So if you don't have electricity and water in your house for a week, obviously you're going to want your government to do something about it, even if it means stop sanctioning China or whatever country. And that's maybe something that China also wants to do and demonstrate that they're able to do.
What makes it really interesting is also that goes both ways. And I think that plays back into your comment very, very early on this conversation about, well, your quote unquote Western countries, their secret service, their whatever offensive operations they're engaged in, they tend to be very, very low key about it, for good reasons. Yeah. We don't know to what degree your Chinese infrastructure is vulnerable to, for example, NATO or US or whatever countermeasures or sabotage or espionage.
And also very quickly to finish on, one of the reasons that happens is because if you conduct this massive cyber attack that destroys the power grids, then you as a country know you have a vulnerability there, and you're going to improve it, which means that they're not going to have that capability again.
Yep.
So you don't do it unless you really need to. So you keep it secret.
That's a good point. And I think on that, we need to wrap up. We're out of time. I want to thank you very much for your insights. I'm going to post links to Hugo's LinkedIn on the video description. Visit our CyAN website and see you in the next one.
Thank you very much. See you.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.